Think about the last time you changed your mind about something important. Not because someone sat you down and showed you evidence. Not because you did the research. But because somewhere, somehow, the world around you just shifted and the thing you used to believe started feeling embarrassing to say out loud. You didn't notice it happening. Nobody announced it. The ground just moved beneath your feet, and you moved with it, and you called it growth. But what if it wasn't growth? What if something you couldn't see had already decided what you would believe next, long before the thought ever felt like yours? That is what this story is about. And by the time it is over, you will never look at your own mind the same way again. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. There is a man most people have never heard of. His name was Edward Nathaniel Carson. He was not a politician. He was not a general. He never ran for office, never led a march, never stood on a stage and gave a speech that anyone remembers. What he did was quieter than all of that and far more powerful. He sat in rooms. He made phone calls. He wrote memos. He consulted psychiatrists and social scientists and newspaper editors. And in doing so, he helped reshape what an entire generation of Americans believed without a single one of them ever realizing he had touched their minds. He did this in the 1940s and 1950s, in the years after the Second Great War, when the country was exhausted and hungry for certainty, and the architecture of the modern American mind was still being built. He was not alone. There were others like him. But his story is the one that opens the door. And once you walk through it, you begin to see that the door was never really closed. It was just made to look like a wall. To understand what Edward Nathaniel Carson did and why it worked so completely on so many intelligent people, you first have to understand something that most of us were never taught in school, something that cuts right to the center of what it means to be a human being thinking inside a society. The thing is this: your beliefs are not primarily the product of your reasoning. They are the product of your environment. And the men who learned to control the environment learned, by extension, to control the beliefs. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is psychology. This is history. This is a pattern that has repeated itself across centuries, across cultures, across every civilization that has ever risen and collapsed. And it is running right now, today, in the media you consume, the conversations you have, the things you feel comfortable saying, and the things you have learned to keep to yourself. The story of how this system works, and how it has always worked, begins not in the 20th century, not in Washington or London or any modern capital, but in ancient Athens, in a city built on the idea that free men could think freely. Because Athens is where the trap was first articulated, and where the first man to name it was destroyed for doing so. His name, for the purposes of this story, we will call Marcus the Questioner. He was a philosopher. He walked the streets and the market squares and the public baths of his city asking the one question that the city could not tolerate. How do you know what you know? He did not ask it to humiliate people. He asked it because he believed it was the most important question a human being could ask. And for decades, the city let him ask it. They found him eccentric, amusing, even a little irritating, the way a persistent fly is irritating. But when he was an old man, when his questions had begun to take root in too many young minds, when the answers people had always assumed were suddenly uncertain, the city moved against him. They charged him with corrupting the youth. They put him on trial. And in the end, they gave him a choice between exile and death. He chose death. He drank the poison himself, calmly, surrounded by his friends, because he believed that a life lived inside an unexamined belief system was not worth living at all. The city killed him not because he was wrong. The city killed him because he was dangerous. And the danger was not the answers he gave. The danger was the question he kept asking. What Marcus the Questioner understood, and what his executioners understood even better, was that every society is held together not by facts, but by shared beliefs. Shared beliefs about who deserves power and who does not. about what is sacred and what is profane, about who belongs and who is the outsider, about what is possible and what is permanently off the table. These beliefs do not need to be true to be effective. They only need to be held collectively. And once enough people inside a group hold a belief, the belief begins to enforce itself without any external pressure at all. The group does it. The neighbors do it. The family does it. The institutions do it. And the individual who holds a different view begins to feel not just wrong, but broken, dangerous, a threat to the very fabric of things. We are taught to navigate life by looking at a kind of invisible window, checking if our thoughts are acceptable or sensible before we dare to utter them. And in time, we become architects of our own censorship, building a personality that fits neatly within the frame. Medium, this is not weakness. This is the human nervous system doing exactly what it evolved to do. In the ancient world, being cast out of the tribe meant death, starvation, exposure to predators. The terror of social rejection is wired into the oldest, deepest parts of the human brain. And the men who learned to weaponize that terror learned to control populations without armies, without prisons, without a single act of visible violence. Now we come to the laboratory. Now we come to the moment in the middle of the 20th century when what had always been an intuitive, practiced art became a documented, replicable science. It happened in a series of experiments so simple, so elegant, and so deeply unsettling that they have haunted psychology ever since. The year was 1951. A psychologist named Solomon Marsh, working at a university in the northeastern United States, sat down to study a question that had been burning inside him since the end of the Second Great War. The question was this: how much social pressure does it take to make an ordinary, intelligent person deny the evidence of their own eyes? His method was strikingly simple. Groups of participants were asked to identify which of three lines matched the length of a reference line. The task was clear. The answer was obvious. There was no ambiguity. But unbeknownst to the real test subject, the majority of the group consisted of actors who intentionally provided incorrect answers. EBSCO. They would look at the lines, look at each other, and confidently announce the wrong answer. And then they would wait. And what Solomon Marsh found, watching through one-way glass, would change how psychologists understood the human mind forever. Remarkably, about 36.8% of the actual participants conformed to the incorrect group consensus, despite knowing the answers were wrong. This finding highlighted the powerful influence of social dynamics, revealing that the desire for acceptance can lead individuals to prioritize group consensus over their own perceptions. EBSCO, but the percentages do not capture what was most disturbing. What was most disturbing was the process happening inside the subjects' minds as they sat there, looking at lines they could plainly see were different lengths, surrounded by people confidently saying otherwise. Participants who conformed to the majority on at least half of the trials reported what the researcher called a distortion of perception. These participants expressed the belief that the actors' answers were correct, and were apparently unaware that the majority were giving incorrect answers. Wikipedia, they did not merely say the wrong thing to avoid conflict. Some of them began to genuinely see the wrong thing. The social pressure did not just change their behavior. It began to change their perception of reality itself. Think about what that means. Think about it slowly. These were adults, educated people, looking at lines on a piece of paper. And the presence of a group confidently asserting the wrong answer was enough, in a significant percentage of cases, to make them doubt, and eventually override, the direct testimony of their own eyes. Now ask yourself what happens when it is not lines on a piece of paper. What happens when it is a political belief, a historical narrative, an economic theory, a story about who the good people are and who the dangerous ones are? What happens when the group is not 6 actors in a room, but 300 million people, and the medium through which the consensus is delivered is not a spoken statement, but every newspaper, every television broadcast, every radio program, every social media algorithm, every conversation at every dinner table in the country, all pointing in the same direction, all saying the same thing with the same confident, casual certainty, as if it were simply obvious, as if any reasonable person could see it, as if only something were wrong with you if you were looking at the lines and still seeing something different. That is the invisible system. And in the 1920s, decades before Solomon Marsh ever ran his experiments, a man had already figured out how to build it. His name, for our purposes, is Raymond Ellis. He was born in Vienna at the tail end of the 19th century, the nephew of one of the most famous psychologists who ever lived, a man whose work on the unconscious mind had turned the field of human psychology upside down. Raymond Ellis immigrated to the United States as a child and grew up watching how the American press worked, how people read newspapers, how crowds behaved, how a single story, told the right way, in the right publication, attributed to the right authority, could sweep through a population like wind through a field of wheat. He was fascinated by this. He was also, from a very young age, completely practical about it. He was not interested in what people should believe. He was interested in what they could be made to believe, and how quickly. What his uncle had suggested was that often there is a divorce between one's conscious thoughts and feelings and desires which do not fit with one's self-image and which are therefore suppressed. Raymond Ellis recognized that this fact renders human beings manipulable. If one can design propaganda or psychological operations that bypass the conscious and rational faculties of the individual, targeting instead suppressed emotions and hidden desires, it is possible to move people to adopt beliefs and behaviors without them being aware of the underlying motivations leading them on. Academy of Ideas. He opened a consulting practice in New York City and began taking clients. Corporations, governments, political campaigns, anyone who needed the public to think something specific and was willing to pay for the knowledge of how to make it happen. He called his technique the engineering of consent, that is, the manufacturing of public approval. History today, he believed this was not a sinister thing. He believed it was necessary. He believed the public was too irrational, too emotional, too easily misled by demagogues and panic to be trusted with unfiltered information. Someone had to shape the narrative. Someone had to decide what the people would receive and how they would receive it. And he believed that the men who did this shaping were performing a public service, not a manipulation. That distinction between service and manipulation is one he never fully examined. And it is the distinction that haunts everything that came after him. His most famous early campaign happened in 1929 in New York City on Easter Sunday. He had been hired by a major American tobacco company whose chairman had a problem. Women in the United States were not smoking cigarettes in public. It was considered improper, unseemly. A woman seen smoking on the street was looked down upon, and the chairman understood that this cultural taboo was costing him a fortune. Half the potential market for his product was essentially off-limits because of a social belief that nobody had ever consciously chosen to hold, a belief that had simply accumulated over generations like sediment, until it felt like bedrock. He hired Raymond Ellis to dissolve it. Ellis consulted a psychiatrist, asking what the psychological basis was for a woman's desire to smoke. The answer he received was that cigarettes, equated with men, could become torches of freedom for women. That was his inspiration. His campaign was to get young women who stood for feminism to light up cigarettes in public as an act of emancipation during New York's Easter parade. He believed this would make its way into the nation's newspapers, History Today, and so the stage was set. He did not advertise. He did not buy a billboard or take out a newspaper ad. He created an event. He recruited a group of fashionable young women who were told they would be participating in a demonstration of female liberation. He told the press in advance exactly what to expect, framing it as a spontaneous uprising of emancipated women striking a blow for equality. He was quick to let the press know about this supposedly spontaneous show of female emancipation, and the story appeared in newspapers across America. New histories. Sales of cigarettes to women rose sharply from that point. They went from 5% of all cigarettes sold and quickly doubled again, and peaked in 1965 at 33% of sales. Front Porch Republic. The product had not changed. The evidence had not changed. The health consequences had not changed. What had changed was the story wrapped around the product. And once the story changed, the belief changed. And once the belief changed, the behavior changed. And millions of women made a personal choice, felt it as a personal choice, experienced it as an expression of their own individual freedom, not knowing that the feeling of freedom had been engineered in a room by a man they had never heard of, working for a company they trusted to tell them the truth. This is the part of the story where most people want to stop and say, but that was then. We are more sophisticated now. We have the internet. We have fact checkers. We have access to more information than any generation in human history. We would not fall for something like that today. And that feeling, that very confident, very comfortable feeling that you are too smart to be manipulated, that feeling is itself a product of the system. Because the system has always been most effective on the people who were most certain they were immune to it. One of the most unsettling findings in social psychology is how easily people conform to falsehoods. Culture collective. And this remains true not because people are stupid, but because the mechanism runs deeper than intelligence. It runs in the part of the brain that processes belonging, safety, and survival. And no amount of education or critical thinking training fully overrides it, because the mechanism was not built for a world of ideas. It was built for a world of predators and tribal fires and the very real, physical danger of being left alone in the dark. The system exploits ancient hardware with modern software, and the software gets updated constantly, while most people are still running the original firmware. Now here is where the story gets bigger, because what Raymond Ellis built in the 1920s and what Solomon Marsh documented in his laboratory in the 1950s was not something new. It was something ancient that had finally been given a scientific vocabulary. The mechanism had been running for thousands of years. In every civilization, under every flag, behind every altar. What changed in the 20th century was not the mechanism. What changed was the scale, the speed, and the precision with which it could be deployed. There was a concept developed in the latter half of the 20th century by a policy analyst named Joseph Overton, a man who worked at a public policy institute in the American Midwest. He was not trying to expose a conspiracy. He was simply trying to understand why some policy ideas succeeded and others failed, why some things that seemed perfectly reasonable never got traction and others that seemed extreme somehow ended up becoming law. What he described, in plain, unsentimental terms, was a window. The Overton window refers to a range of ideas that are considered acceptable within a society at any given time. Anything outside this window is considered extreme. Once integrated into this window, ideas can profoundly transform norms and collective thought. Open up. The spectrum ran from unthinkable at one end to official policy at the other. An idea begins as unthinkable. It becomes radical when a small, marginal group begins advocating for it. It becomes acceptable when mainstream commentators start entertaining it without completely dismissing it. It becomes sensible when serious people begin treating it as a legitimate option. It becomes popular when the majority starts supporting it. And it becomes policy when the government codifies it into law. An idea can move from unthinkable to radical, from radical to discussable, from discussable to respectable, from respectable to common sense, and from common sense to official policy. Policies once treated as outlandish can become normal. Policies once treated as obvious can become unacceptable. Medium. What Overton noticed, and what very few people who casually cite his concept ever fully absorb, was that this window does not move on its own. It does not drift because of some natural, organic evolution of human wisdom. It moves because people push it. It moves because institutions, media organizations, political strategists, think tanks, and well-funded interest groups apply sustained, coordinated pressure on the edges of acceptable discourse, nudging ideas from unthinkable to radical to acceptable to sensible, one careful step at a time, over months and years and decades. Until a generation grows up in a world where the thing their grandparents would have found completely unacceptable is simply how things are, and they cannot quite imagine it ever having been otherwise. In today's landscape, the Overton window is actively shaped by a diverse network of influential actors, including government officials, media organizations, corporations, think tanks, and digital platforms. While some of these forces aim to encourage healthy public debate, others push to narrow the window, suppressing certain viewpoints or labeling them as extreme. ResearchGate. And here is the critical thing, the thing that makes the system so robust, so self-sustaining, so difficult to disrupt even once you can see it. You do not need everyone to actively push the window. You only need enough people to enforce the new boundaries on everyone else. Because once the window moves, the conformity mechanism that Solomon Marsh documented in his laboratory takes over. The people inside the new boundaries enforce them on the people who are not. They call it common sense. They call it being reasonable. They call it basic decency. And the person on the outside, the person still looking at the lines and seeing what their eyes plainly show them, begins to wonder if something is wrong with them. We need to pause here and tell you about another experiment, because this one goes even deeper than the lines on the paper. This one goes to the question of not just what you believe, but whether you would act against your own conscience to preserve your standing within the group. The year was 1961. A psychologist named Stanley Mercer, working at one of the most prestigious universities in the United States, set up a laboratory and began recruiting ordinary citizens to participate in what he described as a study of memory and learning. He told them they would be playing the role of a teacher. There would be a learner in another room, connected to a device. When the learner got a question wrong, the teacher was to administer an electric shock. The shocks increased in intensity with each wrong answer, from mild discomfort at the low end to a level labeled on the machine with the words danger, severe shock. Participants were instructed by an authority figure to administer increasingly intense electric shocks to a learner who was an actor who feigned pain and distress. Simply psychology. The learner was not actually receiving shocks. The machine was not real. But the teacher did not know this. The teacher could hear what sounded like genuine screaming through the wall. The teacher could hear the learner begging to stop, crying out that his heart was bothering him, going silent, which in context could only mean unconsciousness or death. And when the teacher hesitated, when the teacher looked at the experimenter and said, "I don't think I should continue," the experimenter said simply, "Please continue." The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. In the original study, 65% of participants administered the maximum shock when instructed by the experimenter. This was not a fringe result. It held across multiple replications. Structural learning. 65% of ordinary American citizens, people who had never hurt anyone in their lives, people who were visibly distressed, who were sweating and trembling and pleading with the experimenter to let them stop, continued all the way to the end because a man in a lab coat told them it was necessary. Ordinary people, simply doing their jobs, and without any particular hostility on their part, became agents in a terrible destructive process. Wikipedia. This is not a story about cruelty. The people in that study were not cruel. They were normal. They were the people you pass at the grocery store, the people who coach Little League and hold the door for strangers and cry at funerals. What the experiment revealed was something far more disturbing than cruelty. It revealed that the ordinary human being, when placed inside a system with a clear authority structure, a defined social role, and a sufficiently confident voice telling them that what they are doing is correct and necessary, will override their own deepest moral instincts. Not because they are evil, because the system is more powerful than they know. And now the question that the experiment did not answer, the question that burns at the center of everything we are discussing here, is this: what happens when the authority is not a man in a lab coat in a single room, but the entire information environment of a modern society? What happens when the voice saying "please continue" is not one experimenter, but every television anchor, every podcast host, every algorithm, every social circle, every institution you have been taught since childhood to trust? What happens when the lever is not a machine in a laboratory, but the invisible architecture of acceptable thought itself? What happens is history, and history has a pattern. Go back to ancient Rome, not the Rome of gladiators and spectacle, though that was part of the system too, but the Rome of the late Republic, in the decades before Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and the Republic became an empire in everything but name. The Roman Republic had lasted for nearly 5 centuries. It had survived wars and plagues and barbarian invasions. What it could not survive was the systematic, deliberate manipulation of its own citizens' beliefs about what was possible and what was acceptable. The men who wanted power did not attack the Republic's institutions directly, not at first. They attacked something more subtle. They attacked the stories the Republic told about itself. They funded spectacles and bread distributions and public games that made the citizens feel that the ruling class cared for them. They attacked the reputations of any politician who threatened their interests, not with evidence, but with rumor, with whisper campaigns, with carefully arranged public scandals. They moved the window, slowly, year by year, until the idea of one man holding permanent, unaccountable power, which would have been unthinkable to the Romans of an earlier generation, became not just thinkable, but desirable. The people cheered when the Republic ended. They genuinely cheered. They were not foolish. They were not cowards. They had simply been living inside a belief system that had been quietly, patiently rebuilt around them. Now come forward to the 20th century, to the years between the 2 great wars, when a country in the middle of Europe, broken by defeat and strangled by economic collapse, found itself in the grip of a political movement that should, by any rational measure, have been unthinkable. What happened in Germany between 1933 and 1945 has been analyzed and debated by historians for 80 years. And the conclusion that keeps emerging, the conclusion that the most careful scholars keep arriving at, is not that the German people were uniquely susceptible to evil. The conclusion is that they were ordinary. They were educated, culturally sophisticated people who were subjected to one of the most systematic, technologically advanced campaigns of belief manipulation in human history. The state did not just tell people what to think. It controlled what they could hear. It controlled what they could read. It controlled who they could associate with. It controlled the rituals and the symbols and the songs and the stories. It controlled the atmosphere so completely that to hold a different belief was not just socially dangerous. It was literally impossible to sustain without extraordinary courage, because every signal in the environment said that the belief system you had been given was reality, and anything outside it was madness. This is not a story about a particular political ideology. Every ideology, across the entire spectrum, has used these tools. The mechanisms do not have a party affiliation. They are not owned by the left or the right, by the religious or the secular, by the old world or the new. They are simply tools. And the question of who is using them and to what end is always a question about power. Who benefits from you believing what you believe? Who loses if you start asking different questions? Who put the window where it is? And when did they move it there? And what was it before? These are the questions that make systems nervous. These are the questions that got Marcus the Questioner killed in ancient Athens. These are the questions that Raymond Ellis spent his entire career making sure most people never thought to ask, because a population asking those questions is, from the perspective of anyone managing public belief, deeply inconvenient. Now let us talk about the present. Let us talk about the world you are living in right now, today, as you watch this. Because you might think that with the internet, With the explosion of information, with the ability to access any document, any study, any historical record from the device in your pocket, the era of managed belief should be over. And in some ways, you would be right. The old mechanisms of control, the ones that depended on limiting what information people could access, those have been significantly disrupted. The gatekeepers of the mid-20th century, the 3 television networks, the major newspapers, the handful of publishing houses, those institutions no longer hold the monopoly they once did on what reaches the public mind. But what has happened instead is something that, in certain ways, is even more effective. Because the problem of belief management in a world of information scarcity was always about access. You could only believe what you could hear, read, or see. And so controlling belief meant controlling the supply of information. But in a world of information abundance, the problem flips. The challenge is no longer access. The challenge is attention. And the systems that have been built to capture and hold human attention have also, by their fundamental architecture, become the most powerful belief management systems ever built, not because anyone designed them to be, though some certainly did, but because the economics of attention reward exactly the psychological mechanisms that the invisible system has always exploited. The algorithm does not care what is true. The algorithm cares what keeps you watching. And what keeps you watching is not calm, measured analysis. What keeps you watching is threat and tribal identity and the intoxicating pleasure of feeling that you belong to the group that sees what others cannot see, and the equally intoxicating pleasure of feeling contempt for the group that refuses to. These are ancient feelings. They are survival feelings. And a system that feeds them continuously, around the clock, accessible from the moment you wake until the moment you sleep, is a system that is operating on the oldest, deepest parts of the human nervous system with a precision and a reach that Raymond Ellis could never have imagined, and that Solomon Marsh would have found both revelatory and terrifying. Most of the tactics used to manipulate us rely on our reactivity. The impulse is to pause and recognize the emotions that arise within you while scrolling or watching the news. Sometimes we become addicted to our emotions, and they can feel like a drug. Especially with politics, the feeling of being angry or self-righteous can feel like a civic duty. Culture collective, that feeling of righteous certainty, that electric sensation of knowing you are on the right side of history while others stumble in the dark, that is the system working perfectly. Because a person in that state does not ask questions. A person in that state defends. A person in that state repeats. A person in that state becomes a node in the network, transmitting the belief to everyone around them, enforcing the window, keeping others inside it, doing the work of the system without any compensation, without any awareness, and with complete sincerity. And here is where we must be very precise, because this is the part of the story that gets misunderstood most often. The people inside the system are not stupid. The people enforcing the window are not villains. The people who transmit the managed beliefs are, in the vast majority of cases, doing exactly what they believe to be right. They are doing what Solomon Marsh's subjects did when they called out the wrong answer. They are responding to the most powerful social signals available to them, signals that their nervous system reads as information about survival, about belonging, about whether they are safe in their tribe. The system does not require bad actors to function. It does not require a room full of conspirators. It requires only that the mechanisms of social conformity, the ones that have been running in the human brain for 100,000 years, be given the right environment to operate in. And then they operate, reliably, predictably, at scale. So what do you do with this? What does a person do once they understand the mechanism, once they can see the architecture of the invisible system they have been living inside? This is the question that most documentaries about manipulation and propaganda fail to answer, because the answer is not dramatic. It does not involve a revolution or a manifesto or a single act of defiance. The answer is older than Raymond Ellis and older than Solomon Marsh, and older than Joseph Overton, and it was given to us by a philosopher who chose death over an unexamined life. The answer is the question, how do I know what I know? Not as a rhetorical flourish, not as a way of signaling your sophistication, but as a genuine, daily, uncomfortable practice. Where did this belief come from? Who benefits from my holding it? What would I have to look at honestly if I let myself question it? What am I afraid to find on the other side of that question? These are not the questions of a person who has no convictions. These are the questions of a person who takes their convictions seriously enough to want to know whether they are actually theirs. The question we rarely ask is this: if our sense of what is right and wrong, what is acceptable and unacceptable, is so dependent on these shifting social permissions, do we ever truly have a core identity that is independent of society's permission? Medium, that question is not comfortable, but it is the question that the entire invisible system is built to prevent you from asking, because the system cannot tolerate the person who is genuinely asking it. It can absorb the cynic who says everything is manipulation and therefore nothing matters. It can absorb the conspiracy theorist who locates the control in a single, identifiable enemy. But it cannot absorb the person who sits quietly with the real question, who traces their own beliefs back to their origins, who is willing to discover that some of what they hold most firmly was given to them by forces they never consented to, and who then decides, consciously and deliberately, what they actually want to carry forward. That person is not controlled. And in a system built on invisible control, a person who is genuinely not controlled is the most radical thing there is. Not radical in the sense of extreme. Radical in the original Latin sense, going to the root. Going all the way down to the place where the belief was planted and looking at it in full light and deciding from that place what is true. The invisible system that decides what you believe has been running for as long as human societies have existed. It has worn the face of religion and science and nationalism and progress and tradition and revolution. It has spoken in the voice of priests and politicians and advertisers and algorithms. It has never needed you to know it exists. In fact, it has always worked best when you were certain it did not. The moment you are certain you cannot be manipulated is the moment the manipulation is most complete. But you are here. You watch this to the end. And that means somewhere in you, there is a question. Hold on to it. Resist the urge to immediately replace it with an answer you were given. Sit with it. Follow it. Because that question, if you let it, will take you somewhere the system cannot follow. And that is the only kind of freedom that has ever been real. That if it resonated, like, share, and tell me what you're thinking below. Subscribe for more.